Everybody settling? Comfortable? Great. Well, a very, very good morning, ladies and gentlemen and distinguished guests. A very warm welcome to the College of Design and Engineering here at NUS, and specifically for this Carbon Symposium this morning. Really, really glad that you are able to make time to come and join us in this dialogue, which is a very hot topic, as I think all of you would agree. And we look forward to some very interesting dialogue and discussion in this symposium. As I say, I'm sure all of you have already heard the word carbon repeatedly, right, over the past several years. Probably in the context of carbon emissions and its impact on climate and all the disruptions that has created in our world. Some of you may have heard the word carbon in the context of what I call the commodification of carbon, turning it into a commodity to be traded, to be sold, and to be taxed. And many of you may be engaged, in fact, in that aspect of carbon. So carbon, but as a fact, is a lot more than that. It's really part and parcel of our very being, as scientists have continued on a perpetual quest to discover and understand the origins of life and the constituent elements of life, as this particular research in the SDSS, which is the Sloan Digital Sky Survey research in the United States, one amongst many. They are continuously trying to discover and seek answer. And it is a fact through research like this that show to us that carbon is in fact one of the 6 most common elements of life on Earth. And these elements, as you can see here, hydrogen, nitrogen, sulfur, oxygen, phosphorus, and carbon, are all present. And indeed, in our human body, that these elements are also there. By mass, over 96% of our body are made up of oxygen, which is 65%, carbon, 18.5% in our body, 9.5% is hydrogen, and 3.3% nitrogen. So the point is that carbon is not just something that is external to us. It is an intrinsic and inextricable part of human life and living. The air we breathe, the food we consume, even the toothpaste you use. In some cases, you know the carbon toothpaste for you to polish your teeth has carbon. So it is really very much embodied in everything we do. And I hope that is the message that you would continuously be reminded of and hear throughout this symposium as our esteemed panel of speakers will share with us throughout today, okay? So just keep that in mind so that we have indeed a much more holistic and balanced view of this notion of carbon. So it is a complex issue, of course, right? When we look at this multifaceted impact that has to do not in terms of the carbon in the air and so on, but it is as part and parcel of our lifestyle and life itself. The question arises, what price should we place on carbon if you take all these different aspects into consideration? What is the price of carbon? And how can we address the equitable distribution of that? Not just within our own island state, but indeed globally, in order to tackle this imminent challenge that is facing us today, climate change and other things. So this will be a persistent critical question that our architectural and environmental design pursuit will have to tackle. And this is again the focus and purpose of today. And I hope that we can have a very rich dialogue and conversation going forward. So with that brief intro, it's my honor and privilege to introduce our Senior Vice President of NUS, Professor Lau Teck Sing, to say a few words in opening.
Thank you.
Here, Prof. Lau and I have known each other for like decades. And amongst many things that he had done, and he's just been the CEO of NRF, and he stepped down, and NUS immediately grabbed him back and made him the SVP. And we were deans together, believe it or not.
When we were a bit younger.
When we were a lot more younger in 1998. He was engineering, and I was in, at that time, called architecture, building, and real estate. So we had two fun years doing that together. And of course, he went on to do a lot more great stuff for Singapore, for the country, and indeed for the world, and has been well recognized globally for his contribution. And right now, he's also the chairman of the Singapore Maritime Institute, and he's a fellow of the Singapore Academy of Engineers, and a fellow of IEEE, and an international fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineers in UK. So with that, thank you very much for coming.
Hey, thank you for all the nice words. Right, we were indeed, colleagues together. I running engineering, and Kipo running at that time architecture and building and estate management. Right, those were the early days, and of course during that period, sustainability was not in our radar screen at all. But I would say that for Singapore, sustainability was not top of our priority until very recently. Though it appeared in our priority list of things that we need to do when NRF first started in 2006. And when Dr. Tony Tan started NRF, one of the key initiatives he started was strategic research programs, where we are willing to invest not a few $1 million, hundreds of $1 million in technology areas critical for Singapore. And one of the key programs we started was clean water and clean energy. It was just called clean energy and clean water because they were existential to Singapore, right? And that was the first move by Singapore in terms of a shift in our strategy for funding research. Prior to that, our key narrative that drove our strategy was the economic narrative. But I will tell you that, my political masters will still say that the economic narrative is still central. But fortunately for us, investing in science and technology that addresses our existential needs and our economic narrative are not mutually exclusive. The fact that we've invested in water have also allowed us to build a water industry for ourselves. But as we move from 2006 to 2010 to 2015, and I use those markers because those were the start of each 5-year budgets for our research investments. We realized then that we need to then address key issues that Singapore faces up to. And one of the key issues we're facing up to is the impact of climate change on Singapore. It impacts us on two ways. One, as the climate changes, there are certain things that are happening that will impact us very directly, sea level going up, right? Two, the other thing that impacts us is because we need to work together with the rest of the world to make sure that we are able to mitigate the impact of climate change. We need to be responsible to address the emissions of carbon, for example. So I would say since our 2020 plan, which means from the period financial 15 to 20, we actually expanded our investments in areas related to sustainability. And now in our 2025 plan, where Singapore is investing $25 billion, that is now key and central to our urban sustainability and solution sustainability plans, right? So you'll find that, clean energy is top on everybody's mind. But I think we also realize that, key for us as we transform Singapore is seeing how we can transform the built environment. So I actually have a sort of a tagline below a Carbon Symposium, which is Carbon Symposium for the Built Environment. Because you won't be surprised, NUS organizing more Carbon Symposium, but addressing other areas. For example, a Carbon Symposium for the manufacturing sector. We are moving into an era where resources are scarce. And I can tell you that the enlightened consumers, as we move forward in time, will demand that we actually manage the end of life of every product that we manufacture, right? So, with this, I would say that, the organization of this symposium is very timely. It actually showcases, what my colleagues are doing together with partners in addressing this very important issue. And for us in Singapore, from NR's perspective in particular, we always find the built environment the most difficult sector to transform. Right? We all say that, the technology level is low in that industry, the introduction of automation is low. But now we have an added, challenge, which is the consideration of carbon, right? So it's not only about, buildings that, emits minimum carbon and uses least energy, etc., but also to consider the building itself when we build them, and the many other issues that comes along with it. So I'm going to leave you, with my colleagues and very distinguished speakers they've got together, and we think that this is a very exciting new area, and if we can get our colleagues from the regulatory agencies together with our colleagues from the builders and the people who own buildings and the people who are going to design and the consultants and all this, together as a community, if we address this in a single-minded manner, I think we will show the world that Singapore can move forward and continue to build Singapore in a sustainable manner. We've done so well for 50-odd years. I think we need to make sure that we continue to do so for the next 50 years. So with this, I wish you all a very fruitful morning and enjoy the discussions that is going to ensue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Teck Seng. Well, the challenge is ahead for all of us. So without further ado, just let me acknowledge, as Teck Seng said, we are very pleased that the audience today being represented by all sectors of our industry, both from the government agencies as well as the private sector, and of course academia. So it should be a very good platform for all of us to have this dialogue together moving forward. Okay, so without further ado, my pleasure to introduce this first speaker. First and foremost, it's unfortunate that Professor Terani couldn't be with us in person, but he's pre-recorded a talk for this morning. So, but nonetheless, let me very quickly introduce him. Professor Nader Terani is an Iranian-American designer and educator. He's a professor and a former dean of the Cooper Union, Irving Channing School of Architecture. And previously, before joining Cooper Union, he was a professor at MIT, School of Architecture and Planning, and also a former head of the department. And in 1986, he founded the Office DA with his partners. And in 91, he then Ponce joined the firm later on in 91. And then in 2011, he and Catherine Faulkner co-founded another company, Nada AA, and then Arthur Chang joined that firm later. So the practice and the sort of academic development is in parallel, as you can see, in his career path. And I think that's a very important part of the development. So without further ado, let's play the pre-recorded video. Thank you.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. My apologies for not being able to join you there in person. I want to thank Eric Lheureux for having invited me to be part of the symposium, albeit remotely, and also thank him for inviting me to be a participant to his book. The projects I'm going to present today revolve around three schools of architecture that in some way contribute to the discussion of a carbon footprint of the future. The idea that all three buildings in some way or another are dealing with the specifications of materials or processes of construction and naturally renewable resources, as well as the prospect of preservation, adaptive reuse, or variations of usages of existing conditions that are central to the logic of these buildings. But in addition to that, all three of them being schools of architecture means that we have an audience of both faculty and students that are either teaching, learning architecture, producing cultures within canonical buildings sometimes, which are not necessarily neutral backdrops, but protagonists that evoke different models of learning and teaching as a central part of their mission. In some instances, those are characteristic buildings like Yale, where the stacking of the auditorium, the exhibition hall, and the crit halls are a central public chamber around which the studios operate. In the Central Hall in Sao Paulo, the Artigas building, that was a civic gesture with a lot of public potential, never imagined to be the space of revolution and demonstration itself. And on the other end of the spectrum, the AA, essentially two residential units, row houses that have become a central catalyst for polemics, debates, and transformations of architectural culture over the decades. All of this to say that in some ways there is no ideal type for the School of Architecture, but somehow that the transformation of certain types have this capacity of changing architectural culture, notwithstanding the school of thought as proposed by its various chairs and deans. Consider the terraces of the GSD, essentially a theater typology, creating a spectacle out of the process of design. Everybody's on stage or looking at somebody else. The building invokes this kind of behavior in the way that it has set itself up and sets up a certain culture that survives and extends beyond what Moneo or Silvetti or Cohen did. By extension, SciArc and its elongated warehouse produces a different culture whereby biking and skateboarding along a crit wall that is the length of the building produces yet a third kind of thing. So the culture that is instilled in these buildings is also a central part of my preoccupation, because a sustainable building also has this capacity to outlive the various schools of thoughts that it invokes. In the context of the three schools that we've studied, obviously various scales and different programs, different cultures, Georgia Tech was unique in that it offered us an existing factory space, a high bay space with a truss and gantry crane that offered the prospect of flexibility of a very specific kind. If we were able to suspend new studio spaces and infrastructures from the top, we could gain a certain level of flexibility on the ground so that the ground could be cleared out for major events. In turn, the infrastructure on the ceiling, on the roof, could introduce transformable lighting that could hang up and down, a new second means of egress, as well as added studio space that connects to that ground. Literally suspended from above, it also gives a new life to the gantry crane. Indeed, it has a new design life, and the perimeters are these exceptional crit spaces with the guillotine wall here to your left. But more importantly, with all of the different planimetric working scenarios, it also offers a way of imagining this as a space of a lecture hall, a cinema space, a place of installations of art, and a great height to do many other things with. In many ways, this is related to our building in Melbourne. At the heart of the campus of Melbourne Uni, where there are a great many Georgian courts, we had the opportunity of transforming the Melbourne Uni School of Architecture, School of Design, essentially, MSD, internalizing one of those Georgian courts in the context of a large atrium that could then serve as the hub of design for architects, landscape architects, planners, and many others. The strategy of the building initially was to create dedicated studio spaces, what they've never had before. Within that context, we had conceived of the studio spaces on top of the building with the hub right underneath it. It was VE'd out within the first month or two when they realized they didn't have the budget. And so part of our invention, if any, had to do with mining out of the net to gross area a dedicated space for studios on the vertical axis, including the corridors and workspaces instead of railings. And by doing this, extending the life of those studio spaces into the research spaces, into the classrooms, and into other studios and exhibit halls. The technologies that would support this would be a hybrid structural system with CLT screwed in with rebars and a metal infrastructure to hold together the concrete pour, the sum of which would create these light decks that whereby the CLT would be the formwork for the building itself. In turn, on the first tray, there would be collective working tables. On the second tray, there would be desks for laptops and design activities. And on the top floor, crit spaces where seating was arranged. In that way, the disciplines of architecture, landscape architecture, planning, and other disciplines would all be in a mixing chamber going up and down together. Part of this also involved the possibility of one or two dedicated studio spaces that would be flexible enough to allow the base of the atrium to act for lecture spaces. And so we conceptualized in this instance a wide atrium, 22 meters wide, with deep beams and coffers that would bring in natural daylighting, but no direct sun. Suspending from that the actual studio spaces that would never touch the ground. Massive at the top and light at the bottom, they're fashioned around the idea of a Renaissance palazzo upside down, essentially the rustication of that system being conceptualized from the other direction. Excuse me. With massive timber above and light veneers of plywood below. In the context of the spaces above, you inhabit the wood. The depth of the structure is something you inhabit, and the studios are encased in this massive wood. As you get to the bottom, you come to understand the thinness of the structural system in tension, suspended, and of course at the end grain is allowed to express in some way the acoustic functions of the space. Being a school of architecture also means that these are not only spaces of pedagogy, but pedagogical spaces, that the details of these buildings have a didactic function. Here, fabricated almost entirely off-site and transported to the site in early mornings, the building was built instead of in 24 months, in 18 months, and essentially occupied 6 months early. So successful was this building in terms of the studio space that it produced, that now it is almost always occupied by the rest of the population of the university, commonly compromising the activities of the design school, but somehow a very central part of the culture of the university at large. As an addition to this, of course, that this is an addition to the Joseph Reed facade, there was the possibility of taking a facade that was blocked off originally and reactivating it. Part of that meant for us to measure the face of this, to introduce porosity by excavating the windows out of it again, reactivating the entries, and putting structural steel behind it. And by mapping that facade on the interior, realizing how that might extend into the exhibit space of the MSD and also act for lateral bracing in the context of a classroom that would conjoin with that facade and look back out onto the concrete lawn. The building then is composed of a range of sustainable strategies, including the cross-laminated timber, precast concrete systems almost entirely transported to the site, and a bias with natural ventilation that could also gain from zinc perforated skins that would cool the building in relationship to the sun. Imagining a cistern that would collect the water runoff and the activation of the atrium space with natural ventilation. All of this calibrated at the scale of the classroom, but also at the scale of the atrium itself. A cousin of the Georgia Tech building, both of these are studio spaces that are essentially slung upside down. Very different than the Daniels building at the center of Spadina Circle in Toronto. In addition to Knox College, the expansion of the School of Design there was conceived as an adaptive reuse of this extraordinary neo-Gothic building with what is almost more of a landscape addition to the back, a studio space with extensions into the landscape so that future additions could be made within the earth, all being submerged so that the tower of the original Knox College could be seen from Spadina North, and the landscape activated by the different programs of the building. In turn, while the north-south axis is important, the building is in fact activated by an east-west axis with an internal street that connects to the main auditorium, the Fab Lab, the post office, the cafes, and so forth. The idea of this building is to draw in the different disciplines from the campus and connect them to the neighborhoods, open 24/7. And so despite the fact that it's a massive and compact building, it is also at the same time a building that stretches back into the landscape, always extending to it. A remarkable part of this landscape is the roof itself, a kind of shell-structured building conceptualized originally as concrete, whereby the natural daylighting, the structural systems, and the hydrology would be all coordinated into one, fashioned after certain explorations of Felix Candela. We came to realize that it was both over budget and allegedly unbuildable. And because of that, we unleashed the experiment in our own studios, realizing that we could probably build it with a stick construction of sorts, with a radiant panel above, imagining that the heating could come from the concrete below while the cooling could be in the radiant panel above, and save about $1 million by building it in framed steel, almost a low resolution ruled surface for all of these, fabricated in half the time with the radiant panels, and finally finished at a fraction of the cost. It also becomes an extension of the main lecture hall that uses that portal to extend those lectures up into the studio space as one goes above and connects back to Spadina North. The connection between the core of this building and its environment, its urbanism, is a central part of the idea of this building, so that people from the neighborhood can also use it. So the Fab Lab has an address within the building, but also outside, using the courtyard outside to invite Spadina North back into it. The street looks into this double height, the internal street looks into this double height space, while the garage door opens out and extends the culture of the school into the very landscape that it sponsors. Now, completely distinct from this animation, but a central part of the culture of this building is also to imagine ways in which its carbon footprint, its energy, and its thinking are about reducing its energy costs and making it a vital building for all of its users. So all of the ways in which the building is conceived around this idea of the landscape is also trying to activate the building as naturally as possible with natural daylighting, minimizing the use of electricity. But also imagining that it's occurring within a context that is primarily vehicular on the outside, but students get into it by way of bicycle and foot, being right close to campus. There's a subway system, a rail car that goes around the site. And of course, at the micro level, trying to activate as much of natural ventilation as a central part of the mission of the school. I close out this talk with a reference to my new home of the last 7 years where I served as dean. That is another project that was conceptualized as an adaptive reuse, essentially, when John Haydock reconceptualized the building in terms of its pedagogical mission, albeit in a very different way. How the School of Architecture and the School of Art are sandwiched around the Fab Lab to embed their cultures into each other and activate each other in different ways. That is the culture I've inherited, and these schools are in some ways a contribution to the idea that schools of architecture, their physical spaces, are a central part of how we can conceptualize that architecture is not a mere backdrop for pedagogy, but is an active protagonist in it, and how they often survive the very schools of thought that are brought into them. With that, I thank you so much and hope I can join you live from the airport, but I look forward to hearing everything else online. Good morning and good evening. Thank you so much.
Well, how about that for a primer? That really sets the tone and the theme of, to me, creativity and integrated system thinking. It's very prevalent across all those case studies that were presented. Every project has an immediate constraint of budget, and you keep hearing that. But through the kind of creative thinking, there's a lot that can be done to address that issue. So it should not be seen as an immediate constraint, but as a way to guide our thinking how best to bring all these different needs together through the architectural process, design process, and then to realize the final product, whilst sticking to cost and, as you heard repeatedly, time. That's money too. And I think that kind of holistic thinking is so critical to help us propel our mission towards, greener, more sustainable, and more resilient architecture. In this particular instance, the context of architectural schools, because that's where we train, educate, and produce future generations of architects and engineers and etc. So great. Now we come back home to our home base. Next speaker, come up. Professor Eric Lehoux is Dean's Chair, Associate Professor at our Department of Architecture in the College of Design and Engineering at NUS. Eric and I have been partners in crime for the past few years. He was my vice dean for special projects. And also he directs the Master of Architecture program. Amidst all the work that he's been doing, he's been extremely accomplished this last year. He's gotten a PhD from RMIT, just, right, December. And he got registered, he got the fellow of the American Institute of Architects last year. And just this year, he became a licensed architect with the Board of Architects Singapore, whilst doing everything else that he's going to talk to you about. So extremely, extremely happy to have worked with him, and we'll continue to see what you have to offer moving forward. Eric, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Kipo. So thank you. I'm delighted to be here this morning. I'm going to read a little bit from my notes, if you don't mind. Can we have the deck? So I'm going to take you through the story of the adaptive reuse of SD 1 and 3 and explore the promises and challenges of a net zero energy and super low carbon adaptive reuse in this part of the world, illustrating, I hope, how decarbonization and embracing the tropical climate in a cohesive piece of architecture can communicate important values to the next generation of architects and built environment experts, the same way that Nader speaks of the building as being an active protagonist in the education of an architect. Understanding SD 1 and 3 requires situating ourselves in the history of the NUS campus that was born during the social, political, and economic upheavals and protests of the late 1960s, where the idea of a center, a quadrangle, lawn, oval, or square, a place for large student gathering, was suspect. Generous, open, and exterior spaces simply do not exist on the Kent Ridge campus plan. And not only could such spaces be seen as a potential political liability, but it's often just too damn hot and wet outside to really enjoy them. The campus also emerged at a time when technology was gaining momentum and manufacturing in Singapore was taking off. The master plan was designed by the Dutch architect and planner S.J. van Endem, with his firm OD 205 establishing the grammar of the interconnected networked buildings. The plan conjures images of circuit boards and mechanical systems, Think Christopher Alexander's notes on the synthesis of form or pattern language. Or Rainer Banham's cover of the architecture of the well-tempered environment. What was important was that the university embraced symbols of efficiency to serve the national aspirations of industrial development. The Department of Architecture is situated at the tail end of the Black Network campus, which is right here where we are. It was an engineering vision, a kit of parts that made the campus appear uniform and regular, communicating ideas of functionality, productivity, and industrialization. The then Faculty of Architecture building, now collectively known as SD 1, 2, and 3, were completed in the late 1970s. I'll leave the details to the historians, though air conditioning was installed in the 1980s, powering visions of comfort for the campus body, ejecting students and faculty from the tropical context and thrusting them into a globalized synthetic climate similar to the multinational companies in which they were expected to work. If you squint, the campus could be anywhere in the suburbs of London, New York, or Sydney. The air conditioning towers were symbols of Singapore's technological and energy might that could transform the campus, the students, and the nation from third world to first world in a single generation. As the founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew asserted, air conditioning was the best invention of the 20th century, making equivalent the tropical world to a temperate one, and so too would the campus be equipped with similar transformational tools manifest in the symbols of air handlers and mechanical towers, albeit with little discussion of the downstream carbon impacts affecting our world today. Since 2014, the School of Design and Environment, now the College of Design and Engineering, has tried to counter the lack of social spaces and its simulated temperate interior by renovating the microcampus of the then school, bringing social and gathering spaces, natural ventilation, and the jungle that were lacking in the original plan to the foreground. 4 buildings compose the effort over the past decade. SD4 to the bottom of the plan, with SD1 and 3 as 2 adaptive reuse buildings that we are currently in, and a planned and designed net zero carbon adaptive reuse and timber building round out the narrative. SD4 was the first part of the story. Completed in 2019, it set ambitious operational energy targets and helped build confidence with the university administration that a tropical net zero energy building was possible for a publicly funded institution here in Singapore. The next important chapter following SD4 is SD1 and 3, and it has been a trickier endeavor in many ways. The existing buildings were only 39 years old when the redesign began in 2015. They were in an ambiguous state, not sufficiently old enough to be considered historically important, not architecturally significant enough to be conserved outright. Another set of values was needed to convince the university that decarbonization and careful attention to the design, space, and detail would be valuable to the campus and pedagogically critical for the next generation of architectural students educated within. The design approach returned to some of the original values of durability while recasting design, adaptability, and debate as central tenets working through the plans. The pile foundations and embedded carbon in the structural frame, the campus's carbon legacy, were artifacts that could be repurposed and reworked alongside improving the interior and the envelope's spatial, atmospheric, and detail qualities. By doing so, the architecture could present a vision of carefully conserving the university's resources by reusing the existing carbon invested in the original campus formation while transforming it for future generations. The buildings could be seen as a bank of sorts, a vault with an embodied carbon deposit that could be transformed. And with this, the investment could be improved upon architecturally, increasing the deposit's value for the next generation. The design asserts that by improving, enhancing, and augmenting this carbon investment, the buildings and their embodied carbon become even more valuable, not just as a numerical quantification or quantum of real estate, but a carbon asset that is filled with 39 years of history, memories, and attachment from alumni and students who have gone through its spaces, and if designed carefully, delightfully, could serve as an active protagonist in the architectural education in Singapore. The values of reuse and reworking with the existing buildings are seemingly obvious, especially in an age of our climate catastrophe. However, they run contrary to the deeply embedded cultural expectations where new buildings underpin a forward-looking, nation-building narrative. The change in expectation from nation-building anew to national reuse will be one of the greatest challenges on the campus, in architectural practice, and the developmental policies in Singapore in the decades ahead. The SDE 1 and 3 innards were highly problematic, especially when I arrived here on the campus 20 years ago. The original buildings contained a 4-story stack of unconnected floor plates, while interior renovations from the 80s to the early 2000s sealed the envelope, replaced natural ventilation with ducted air conditioning, and prioritized faculty offices over student learning spaces. In short, it was a poor space to learn from and an incredibly labyrinthian in its internal arrangement. What was conceived by the university as a facilities renewal project initially, meaning a one-to-one replacement of lights, air conditioners, and life safety systems, a group of 3 students, Wolfgang Kessling, who is here with us, and I started in the same year to challenge those diminutive targets and create a set of design values and aspirations around adaptive reuse, solidified as 8 points. Point 1 was to strengthen the Department of Architecture's identity and clarity of entrance, with a central front door on the ground level and a second portal at the higher campus level that is linked through a circulatory promenade. Point 2, the promenade traverses an exhibition gallery while sectionally cutting through the student studio spaces. A large staircase serves as a social center, seating and interaction space, encouraging dialogue and vertical walking for health and wellness. The staircase's proximity to review areas and the exhibition gallery publicizes student drawings and models to the public, all circulating on its steps. Creating a mixing chamber of movement and circulation, glances and views and exchange. A spectacle and theater similar to the great room of Kahn's Phillips Exeter Library or the atriums noted in Nader's Schools of Architecture. Or alluding to Harrison's designed lobby of the Metropolitan Opera, albeit here at NUS in a more diminutive scale, where students, in my opinion, deserve design quality. And indeed, students use the stair to be seen and to see, creating a social heart for the department. Just as we find in the social ramps that center the life of the Faculty of Architecture in Artigas's big roof architecture building, or in the stair of my undergraduate, Givens Hall, where Wang Yongqi and Chan Soo-kien spent their formative years. The mixing chamber is surrounded by student social spaces that link the floor plates and the different learning levels in one scenographic experience. Suspended catenary lights communicate knowledge of tension, alluding to an inverted Saarinen arch or the funicular models by Gaudi that all come to mind. The stair is surrounded by crit spaces that center the community of architecture around the unique learning experiences of reviews, so that display, debate, and exchange are all made public, visible, and accessible to as a direct counter to the chopped up pre-renovation spaces in the original SDE3, or maybe even to the disconnected studio boxes that we might even find in SDE4. Illuminated by the setting sun in the west, the staircase takes on the quality of an equatorial Vermeer painting, gently casting diffuse daylight across the veneer panel. Excuse the pun. The design, studio, and fabrication occur in public view across the plan of the building. A level from the first level studio spaces peering into the workshop is shown here. Transforming dark, unventilated, and fire-trapped student spaces where students graffitied the ceiling with, "I just want to be a million miles from here," into spatially generous, ventilated, and daylight studio equitable to all students in our program. This is a view of the same studio mezzanine, once the worst space in the building, now transformed into something, I believe, a bit better. We designed storage and pinup equipment to integrate with the studio space, though this hasn't made it through the current administration. Often a cultural change is more difficult than a design change. Point 5, utilizing the existing concrete frame and its embedded carbon as a durable, flexible, and inspirational asset. Making apparent the inherited lessons of Le Corbusier's Maison Domino as a fundamental grammar and durable Rossi-like skeleton that has a loose fit with the program within. While revealing the interior's volumetric dimension by removing partitions, ceiling assemblies, and plan clutter that allow daylight to penetrate deep into the interior. Point 6, reducing air conditioning and minimizing mechanical system symbols while making the remaining equipment visible as a pedagogical tool that improves the air within the buildings by deploying a hybrid comfort system that reduces the embodied carbon through fabric ducts, single-layer sprinklers, and the elimination of generic tile ceilings as much as it lowers the operational carbon. The design embeds the tropical climate, flora, and fauna as a main protagonist as the heart of the architecture. And the design screens the building from its tropical environment and heat gain by creating a deep veil, a brise-soleil, that is an integrated device and a dignified aesthetic expression for the department, combining the formal design and performance capabilities of sunshade, glare control, daylight shelves, and porous ventilation, while camouflaging air intake and exhaust systems, a modesty garment, as Josh Komaroff writes. The veil unifies the SDE microcampus in coloration, filigree, and form that resists the individuated and unlinked architectural forms that predominated the campus expansion over the past 2 decades. The veil defines SD 1 and 3 as a purposeful background building, linking it aesthetically to the head house of SD 4 and its neighbors. The first design action was to remove rather than add, opening the floor plan for cross-ventilation and daylight penetration, and giving every studio a view of the jungle while prioritizing student spaces over faculty offices. In the original plan, faculty offices surrounded the perimeter, embedding the studio into the darker recesses of the floor plate, a fishbowl concept where workshops were isolated on the ground floor and reviews only occurred inside the studio without dedicated public pinup and display areas. It was a compartmentalized, insular place to learn and work. This has been replaced by a lamination on each floor of a dedicated area for public exhibiting and review, a design studio, and a making workshop on each level so that all students have an equitable access regardless of rank or year, and where the generosity of the floor plate is dedicated completely to student learning. Old antiquated systems, air conditioning plenums, and mechanical detritus were removed to improve the experience of the interior volume. Being an archaeologist of sorts, the subtractions add up to 5.6 meters, or 25% of the height of the original building, shifting volume from systems into human experience. As in the 2014 Venice Biennale, curated by Rem Koolhaas, we rejected the size and complexity of concealed building systems, returning architecture to the experience of structure, material, and volume over the management of ducts and acoustic tiled ceiling. The dome in this way is always more inspirational than the duct. We studied how to ventilate and amplify the potential of the structural frame with careful subtractions, from dark and oppressive to open and daylit, completely rejecting the existing student spaces as not only experientially unhealthy, insular, and claustrophobic, but also wasteful in terms of operational and embodied carbon. With the removal, the spaces have become bright, airy, open, and generous, reflecting daylight and driving it indoors. Note the white reflected ceiling on the first bay in this image to increase daylight penetration. The existing structure is revealed for its inherent beauty and spatial generosity, here under a set of existing lecture theaters, where we are now, on the third floor looking up to its underside. And with the minimization of mechanical systems, there's a 50% less embodied carbon than a traditional air conditioning installation, with a savings of 15 tons of CO2 equivalent and the savings of over 15 kilometers of second-layer sprinkler pipes. Fans represent a change from the cold synthetic comfort culture to a decarbonized tropical one. I'll let Wolfgang speak more about hybrid comfort. I'm in session 2. But the approach is that a little sweat is okay, at least at first, where air becomes visible, present, and felt, with fans that in unison provide not only healthier indoor air environments, but a better experience of the architecture. Air is supplied from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., allowing natural ventilation after hours. In an homage to the 1967 Mendes de la Rocha house in Sao Paulo, I believe Eric was just there, fans become important again, not just thermally, but symbolically, as a reference to where we are on the equator. But we're not fanatical. Sometimes air conditioning is okay. For example, when a concentrated thermal load in a space is too high, that would overwhelm the hybrid system. The original lecture theaters were dingy, depressing, no one looks too happy. The renovated theaters that we're in now have open ceilings, fabric ducts, and a single-layer sprinkler with acoustic performance through panels on the wall. The point is to use AEC efficiently and effectively. Doing more with less is the strategy at hand, with a portal as a proscenium and a gradient overlapping panel that maintain a consistent architectural language from exterior to interior. On the exterior, an aluminum and mild steel veil encapsulate the western and northern elevations. Details wrap around existing columns and pre-existing rainwater downpipes with a purposeful contrast of old and new. The envelope comprises a series of light shelves that drive daylight through clear story windows positioned along a gray inner window wall. The specular shelves drive daylight deep into the floor plate, while the brise soleil controls glare and western solar heat gain. The envelope is inversely calibrated to the tree canopy. The top is more opaque, where it sits above the canopy and is subject to more solar load, and open to below, where the tree canopy puts the building into shade. The veil's horizontal members are stacked as a gradient, with each member rotated to optimize views from the inside outward, while creating a shimmering effect across the envelope. While Kahn communicated gravity and decreasing aperture size in the Exeter Library, the veil does the opposite, expressing shade at the top and increasing porosity towards the ground in resonance with the tropical landscape and the equatorial climate. And in the evening, registers the efforts of our students in the design studio as an illuminated lantern. Initially, the veil's design was intended as a recycled configuration of the original anodized aluminum profiles of the 1970s building. The design intent to repurpose and extend its embodied carbon was correct, even though Singapore had not yet established a fully circular material economy, and NUS was not willing to undertake absent warranties. Like all material ecosystems, carbon was only one component of the design decision-making process. In this case, demands from the university regarding liability and the guarantees of durability trumped the design and decarbonization aspirations. Timber was also explored as a carbon-negative material. However, the building code currently prioritizes fireproof ratings, making it highly challenging to achieve compliance. However, despite those losses, even small details throughout become pedagogical moments where this mild steel railing design has a 300%, 180%, and 30% less embodied carbon than the NUS standard stainless steel railing, concrete railing, or glass railings found in SD4. The mounting details not only keep the anchorage free from rain and rust, but picks up the same inverted gable of the facade, albeit at a different scale and orientation. Where balustrades, light shelves, and skirtings wrap, bend, and gently touch the existing domino concrete frame. Creating a veranda with a beach-like view over the tree canopy, a perfect space to decompress and relax for our students. It is conjoined with a faceted round room for discussion and debate, with subtle references to recent UN climate conferences or Stanley Kubrick's fantastic Dr. Strangelove. With views that peer out to the jungle beyond and students peering in to observe the action inside. On the interior elevations, gold railings contrast a naturalistic, verdant, and wild-looking landscape with the architecture. The gold color is purposeful, not only extending the material palette of SD4, but tonally contrasting it with the landscape below. Creating a crown to a framed jungle. The courtyard serves as a window to the sky, centering climate as a protagonist in the architecture, here with the coming storm that draws in the monsoon rain. In this way, the school's center is a verdant heart full of equatorial climate, flora, and fauna. The courtyard initially contained symbols of technology and management, an air conditioning tower that blocked views to an existing banyan tree, all surrounded by a temperate lawn. On the suggestions and effort of Nirmal Krishnani, the air conditioning tower was removed so that the courtyard could take on a platonic form, framing the jungle below. A view just after planting, surrounded by exterior sheltered seating and learning spaces that wrap the jungle, with places for gathering and studying. Where a biophilic experience is always present, here the jungle becomes a valuable non-human protagonist, a contrasting reference to the famous FAU gathering by Artigas. The jungle continues at the entry, where an ode to Marcel Breuer's Whitney pokes through a green wall, illuminating a conference room from within. Rather than framing the city as Breuer's window does, the jungle here is in focus. It also torques a view towards the open air front door of the department, where the drop-off mimics the tree canopy. While delicately alluding to mid-20th century modern motifs that underpin Singapore's architectural landscape. I wish we had the courage to remove the fossil fuel symbols of the parking lot in the foreground, but this is the battle for the next administration. A view from the southwest in the monsoon storm, or as an inverted sunset. SD 1 and 3 are the next chapter of the decarbonization story, not only a net zero energy, but more importantly, containing only 1/5 the embodied carbon of SD4. And for SD1, the remaining 1/5 will likely be paid off in approximately 25 years. With ambitious targets for carbon neutrality in the architecture community by 2030, think Architects Declare and others, adaptive reuse will soon become the future of Asia, and even more so necessary for the future of our warming world. In retrospect, there are many things we could have done better. We could have recycled the aluminum facade. We could have specified aluminum from lower carbon energy sources. We could have replaced the extensive mild steel maintenance railings with safety cables. We could have installed the integrated pinup and storage cabinets and wayfinding. We could have reduced the amount of skim coating and screed thickness. We could have specified where the concrete was coming from. Much of it came from Japan, and replaced it with Southeast Asian sources. We could have specified a lighter weight, lower carbon staircase rather than reinforced concrete. We could have gotten daylight into the central social staircase through the roof, and on and on. But hindsight is 2020, and to get all of this requires not just a technological, financial, or design shift, but a shift of culture in the way in which things are done, or as Nirmal asserts, a shift in policy is necessary. But there are general lessons that can be applied to any project. Reuse the existing carbon investment from generations earlier, do adaptive reuse wherever possible, source materials from low energy carbon grids, transport is actually negligible, subtract rather than add, and remove or reduce systems, retain foundations, embed the climate as a central protagonist and be climatically specific, create a range of thermal environments, and be aware of each carbon cost, create excellent environmental conditions for people. Design is not just about performance, but it's also the performance of the inspirational experience of a building. Build the right team, and buildings take a long time to build. This one, surprisingly, took 8 years from start to finish. We need to be ambitious now to stay ahead of the curve while not losing focus on quality, especially if we're going to meet 2030 goals. And finally, sometimes a little carbon is necessary for a great design. Just know where it comes from and be able to pay it off. Decarbonization is a process of reducing while improving. It requires doing more with less, subtracting rather than adding, but doing it all by enhancing the human experience and positively improving the environment where we live. With decarbonization, the race to the bottom doesn't need to equate to a race to zero quality or zero architectural value. My hope is that the architectural outcomes look good, feel good, belong on the equator, and most importantly, set the foundation and serve as protagonists for the next 30 years of architectural education in Singapore. Just a few more slides. The transformation story isn't done. The next chapter is the adaptive reuse and addition to SD2, a big roof, mass-engineered timber facility to integrate design and engineering students with faculty offices and collaborative design and making labs. Our dean's job now is to raise the money. And the most recent adaptive reuse net zero energy reconfiguration of the Student Center on the NUS campus, the Yusof Ishak House, with construction to start in the middle of this year with fingers crossed. It's exciting to see the lessons of SD4, SD1, and 3 percolate across the campus. I want to end with thanks to NUS, UCI, and the Department of Architecture, notably Lam Ki Po, Ho Pui Ping, Nirmal Krishnani, and the entire faculty and student body who have offered an amazing generosity of trust toward me to ride the past 8 years designing and assisting in delivering these buildings. I also want to thank Heng Chai Keng and Wong Young Chi, who initiated this journey in 2015. Tremendous thanks goes to the team of Bertrand Lasternas, Giovanni Kusu, Wolfgang Kessling, and a long list of research assistants, student designers, and consultants who have helped bring these projects to fruition under very challenging budget constraints. Kipo was talking about that. Not to mention 2 years of the pandemic. It's been a very tough but an amazing journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eric. So every time I hear the story, it really brings back so much memory for me. It was Louis Sullivan, a famous architect, who said, architecture is the crystallization of the thoughts and feelings of a civilization. And those thoughts and feelings continue to change and will be moving forward. The question is, how do we address them with a much longer term goal? When I joined NUS in 1984, the studios were like what we have today. Somewhere along the journey, it became something different, and you saw some of those images. But for me, restoring that original idea, that original value proposition, particularly in the context of educational buildings, is really a very powerful incentive that, as earlier Tarani has said, some things in architecture transcend, right, changes of administration and personalities, etc. And I think that's what we need to grapple of. And when I came back in 1994 after my PhD, SD3, the stair tower that goes to the roof, I set up the daylight measurement station, the sky measurement station on top there. And today, those of you who do simulation for daylight using those sky models, and there are 16 of them in the world, the one that represent the tropics, that data came from upstairs and is still being used today. So those things will continue to persist, and good things we should cherish and value and build on that moving forward, and not to sort of step back from those goals. So thank you very much, Eric, for that. So the next speaker, now we are going again very, very far away. Eric, please come join me, another Eric, Professor Eric Hauweller. He literally just landed this morning from Boston through JFK, and landed this 6 a.m. or something at Changi. But let me do a little bit of publicity. He said he has the best sleep on SQ. Cheers to SQ. It's an 18-hour flight. It's no small matter. And so he's a co-founding principal and partner of Howler and Yun Architecture, research-driven studio, more than 20 designers. So quite a good outfit, pushing the boundary of creative design. And he's currently an associate professor in architecture at Harvard Graduate School of Design, and you saw a picture of the building just now, where he teaches design studio and directs the Master of Architecture thesis program. So really appreciate you taking time and the effort, and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much for hosting me. Thank you to Eric for the invitation. It was actually an invitation to contribute to this book, which I'm just seeing today. It's very exciting. When Eric asked me to think about carbon, I was trying to figure out how could I contribute to this. It's not a topic that we're sort of considered leaders in, although I think in the discussions around climate and carbon, we can ask, where is climate in our students' projects? Where is climate in our work? And you could say climate is everywhere. It's in everything we do. And so just sort of at the invitation of Eric, I sort of thought through some of our projects, and I wanted to share some of those with you today. I titled the talk Lifestyle to Life Cycle. It seems that those two terms are intertwined, and I'll hope to show a little bit more about why. So I always start by asking, what's the matter? What's going on in our world, and how do we think about architecture as a way to participate in that? So I like looking at photos. This one was at the beginning of the pandemic. You see these two ladies sitting a bit too far apart, right? What is this telling us about space, about interaction? This is the beginning of the pandemic where social distancing was kind of just beginning. I've been thinking about public space and technology. How do we interact with each other? how do our devices become this sort of inevitable interface between us in public? And how do they sort of captivate the minds of our young people, and not just kids, but grown-ups? You're sitting in front of a Rembrandt, yet you're still on your screen. They say we live in the age of information, but in a way, it's also the age of post-truth. And so we have so much information, but we don't know exactly what's true anymore. And how do we think about architecture as a kind of a way to participate in that world of post-truth, in that world of political polarization? You know, architecture is the backdrop, architecture is the destination, it is the house where the votes were being ratified. And so architecture isn't passive or non-participating. What's going on in our world? We look around, we've seen things that seem unbelievable at this day and age, that we could still be living through this moment. And this moment, I was recently in Seattle, and you know, Seattle has a beautiful skyline, but you can't see it because of the forest fires, which are being sort of intensified by climate change. So climate is everywhere. And so the question I think that Eric was asking is, what does architecture have to say about it? How can we play a big role in it? The question of carbon form, I think, was raised very eloquently by Elise Tourbe in this magazine Log 47. She was looking at architecture and wondering what forms of architecture explicitly signal a kind of carbon modernity. You could also call it a petro-modernism, a petro-modernity. She sort of noted that the turning radius of the car is inscribed in Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie. So the car is literally shaping our architecture, whereas previous periods, maybe the horse and carriage in the French hotel might have shaped a certain dimension or proportion. I think these are beautiful readings or rereadings of familiar architectures. Right before I left JFK, I had a drink in the TWA building, an incredibly spectacular building, but I can't think of carbon form without thinking about the sort of petro-modernity of the 20th century. A colleague of mine, Keel Mo, has written beautifully, I think he's also in this book, about tracking the supply chains and procurement processes and where do materials come from. He was talking about the Seagram building, and a lot of the bronze came from copper in the desert in Chile. So tracking where materials come from, I think we're going to be doing a lot more of that. And his argument is the Seagram building is a kind of icon of modern architecture, but it's also, in a way, a kind of, I think he called it an exquisite pile of technomass, right? It's a temporary arrangement of materials in the world. In this organization, maybe it'll survive for hundreds of years, maybe it won't. But he sees this as not a kind of authored monument to functionalism, but rather as a kind of embodiment of material, labor, and energy. So operational energy, I think this is one of our sort of easy sort of targets. It's easy to look at. I think a lot of energy was spent actually considering how do we reduce energy. The building we're in, I think, does a beautiful job of screening and shading. In my own practice, we did a small project in Shenzhen, which has a similar climate. The proposal was to create a kind of generosity of building. And so the footprint of the building is quite small, but there's a generous canopy that extends beyond its footprint. We call it a kind of architecture for the architecture, a kind of veil that sort of shades the building before it gets to the building. I think this strategy is well known, so we don't have to sort of get into it too much. A kind of shade structure minimizes the cooling loads for the building. What we thought the contribution might be was in the shaping of the louvers. The louvers could be any shape. We tried a kind of airfoil shape. We tried some concave shapes. And for students, it's amazing to think about what tools you have at your disposal, right? You know, if you're simulating in a sort of sky dome simulation, that was a kind of analog way to test. Now with our digital tools, our students can produce these sort of simulations so quickly and so precisely. Oops, that one may not play. This was a simulation of the ray tracing as light enters and bounces through these two concave profiles. And armed with these simulations, we went to the client, we said, we want to bring light in, but diffuse light, indirect light. And so we want the light to sort of bounce around. And in a way, it sort of brings in light without the heat, which I think is the problem with so much of this type of architecture. We're excited to develop custom extrusions, extruded miles and miles of this material, and then installed it here for this roof. Interestingly, there's so much shading by adjacent buildings that the optimal directions were not obvious. Sometimes they rotated. And so in a way, I think like the building we're in today, it tells you something about its environment. It tells you something about its context. We hope that people will look up and wonder, why are they like this and why are they like that? And what's the quality of light, not just the quantity of light? So can we make this underside more attractive through that sort of double concave profile that we tested and simulated? Embodied energy, I think, is another sort of topic that we're all sort of interested in now. I love the description of a kind of investment or a kind of energy bank and carbon bank in our buildings. We've been interested in mass timber in the States. Everybody's talking about mass timber. Our students are designing with mass timber. There's such a demand for mass timber that the industry can't even meet the demand. And so that's interesting, sort of provoking industries to sort of change direction. But we were sort of interested in the kind of the legacy of timber in the United States. And some friends of mine teach at Yale, Gray Organsky. I've been looking at their work. They have been doing beautiful way to explain the embodied energy in timber structures, but also compared to other cement, glass, metals, and fossil fuels, the kind of energy that goes into the production of these materials, and then advocating for, shouldn't we be thinking about renewables because of the obvious benefits of renewable materials. We proposed this structure in Spokane, Washington. Sometimes our practice operates as architects, sometimes we operate as artists. This was an artist installation, a sculpture, an inhabitable sculpture. Spokane is in the Pacific Northwest, so we thought about the sort of history of timber in that region. And when we think about timber, or the kind of wood shop, we think about these kind of spaces with sort of craftspeople making things. But today we think about wood, it's different formats, right? These are very large format sheets that are being laminated. So laminated timber, engineered lumber, we're talking about much larger pieces, we're talking about younger trees, we're talking about using more material more efficiently to produce these composites. And I think it's opening up interesting opportunities to think about different formats for the modules of the materials that we're working with. We also have been interested in robotic fabrication. And so how can we use the sort of working envelope of a 7-axis robot to carve and shape wood in ways that is different from a kind of extrusion that might look like a beam or a plate that looks like a CLT deck. So rather than replace materials, we're wondering, how can we find a vocabulary that's true to the volumetrics of mass timber? So this modest project, it's an art project. We procured Alaskan yellow cedar. We laminated it. These are glue laminated billets that are 15 inches tall. We produced larger blocks of sort of chunks that we then carved with the robot to express, this is not a robot, this is a human. The rough cut's done by a human, and then the precise cut is done by the robot, like this. But really producing components that are not parallel, so not like a slab or a extrusion. The kind of irregular faces of these blocks really showcase the volumetrics of mass timber, which is what we were interested in. And so this little double amphitheater with the diagonal cut, I can seat about 30 people. The idea was we could create a space for people to gather in the park. We worked on the details with our engineers, learned that even if it's mass timber, there's an awful lot of screws in it, right? There's a lot of mechanical connections here. So how you detail and assemble timber does bring with it, a lot of steel, and there's actually a massive, concrete footing here. So this is for us a kind of research, it's design research. We said, what do we know nothing about? What do we want to know about? So let's move a kind of project in that direction to encourage us to learn about this process. We modeled and built all the pieces. We fabricated those in Wisconsin with a fabricator that we know. Those get shipped in large chunks and assembled in the field. Something like that. So looking from the parts, these are quite beautiful, massive pieces of wood. In the field, they start to show up like this. You get this sort of curvature, you get the different grains. And then the setting, field labor is so expensive and it's so imprecise that actually larger pieces, prefabricated, coming to site is the way to go. These are the drills that put in these 30-inch stainless steel screws. I didn't know they made screws that big. That's pretty impressive. And then this is a sense of the space. This is what we're trying to create, this kind of bowl-like space, a space of discourse, a space to read poetry. It's within the park. This park was in Spokane's waterfront. It's the site of the expo in 1974, which was the first expo that actually foregrounded environmental questions. So kind of nice to sort of bring this back to Spokane. But this is what it looked like a couple months ago. It's all timber, solid timber. And we hope to show in some of these moments the kind of real beauty of a kind of sculptural and volumetric treatment of this material, where we tend to see slabs and beams and maybe curved arches. But this is really trying to showcase that and really trying to find a language for mass timber, whereas right now, I think mass timber is at a kind of adolescent state. We're trying to figure out how to use it and how to simply replace high carbon materials like steel and concrete. But could it find an expression, its own vocabulary, its own syntax? We think that's promising and interesting. And these are sort of, you see the screws get doweled, so there's also a kind of learning about a kind of particular craft and the kind of expression of that craft. A project not by us, but by some colleagues at Cornell, which I find really inspiring. My colleague, my friend Sasha and Leslie from a firm called HANA, they're MIT trained, they're teaching at Cornell. They were using the robot to carve trees. So not using industry to harvest logs and sort of standardize, orthogonal sections. They were saying, this is a diseased tree. This tree died. It was an ash borer, invasive species, killed a bunch of trees. They went to the forest, pulled out the dead tree, and started cutting it. And they weren't cutting it to look like 2x4s or 2x12s. They were cutting it with a kind of sympathy to the original form and asking, how does the shape of the tree actually change the shape of the architecture? I thought that was kind of genius. So the tree has a kind of curvature, the saw follows the curvature, and the aggregation of these sort of curved veneers, they're not veneers, they're sort of half-inch thick slices, produce a different kind of architecture. And so they built this house. It's not really a house, it's just a little studio space to showcase this technique. And so you see the diseased tree and its original curvature is starting to create the overhangs over the windows. The design is very simple. It's a very compact, maybe 10-foot by 10-foot cabin with these incredibly expressive details. Details for the window to pop out, sort of cover over the door. But I think this is really important to think, not just what do I want to do and how can technology and the robot do what I want it to do, which is a kind of brute force approach. I think what HANA has done is they've taken the tree as the origin point and the kind of inherent geometries of the tree and found an architectural expression from that. And from a carbon point of view, it's interesting to think about the industry of forestry and harvesting, and we want responsible sources. But this is a source that's outside of the stream of production. It's not even part of that stream. They're looking for space outside of that stream, and I think that's really inspiring and really, really interesting. So I wanted to show this for you. Keep an eye on these guys. I think they're going to be doing interesting research work and hopefully building in ways that change our way of thinking about architecture. This is Leslie in her cabin with those beautiful windows. These are also 3D printed concrete, but I'm less impressed by this than I am with this. Okay, transportation. You know, we work on embodied energy, operational energy, but we know that the US is like one big suburban sprawl, right? The urban landscape in the US is so challenging. This is Miami, right? The fantastic metropolis surrounded by this incredibly inefficient, single-use, single-family buildings where everybody has to drive, you know, anywhere. I did a studio at the GSD on Miami. It was called Adapting Miami, thinking about climate change in Miami. And we wondered about future flooding. We wondered about this kind of architecture, this kind of urbanism. How do we sort of propose reasonable solutions for a situation like this, which seems in a way almost hopeless, right? This is so low in elevation. With climate change and sea level rise, neighborhoods are going to be flooded. Maybe a solution would be to sort of strategic retreat from the highest risk areas. So thinking about urban context. And then this is a theory that was put forward by Reinhold Martin in the Buell hypothesis. He said, you want to change the city? First change the dream, right? The American dream has produced this desire for this thing, the single-family house with a front yard and a backyard and a fence. But if you really want to change the city, like, you have to give people a different desire, you have to offer alternatives, right? If you desire this, you're going to get this. But if we as designers can imagine something better than this, maybe something higher density, maybe something more communal, more collective, more social, rather than the fence between me and my neighbor. So it's a challenge for designers. How can we offer an alternative dream, whether it's American dream, Singaporean dream? How can we produce something that the public will demand and we're not just pushing it on them, right? That's a big challenge. Some friends of mine, I mentioned Gray Organsky, they teach at Yale. They've been looking at, you know, the single-family house versus a new type, what they call timber city. In the US, so much construction is code-driven. 1-story fire-rated construction with 5 stories of lightweight stick construction. 6 stories is the limit. With mass timber, we can go 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 stories. We can create higher density if we can get the codes to accept mass timber. And I think there's work already happening on this in certain cities to allow for, or to differentiate between light wood framing, which burns very quickly, and mass timber framing, which tends to char, right? Mass timber will retain its structural integrity for 1 hour, 2 hours, whereas light framing will burn through quickly. So getting the fire departments to recognize the difference between 2 modes of construction is essential to get this type of higher density timber construction built in the city. They've been looking at the single family house versus multifamily mass timber housing. And I think this is what you're looking for, 10 units per hectare, and here we've got 240. And what does this allow? It allows us to build high density in cities closer to transit, right? Transit-oriented development, high density, near where transit is available, as opposed to this stuff where there's no transit, there's nothing you can do except drive. So I think this is an interesting sort of confluence of forces. We're talking about renewable materials, we're talking about higher density, and tied into transit. That seems obvious when you think about it, but I think these guys are the first ones that I've heard talk about, not just material research, but kind of urban design and transit research, bringing those things together, producing new types of housing. They're from New Haven, right? So New Haven is sort of this ideal sort of test site. Where is it? Here. Here's Boston, here's New Haven. And they're always talking about, like, where does the wood come from? It comes from Maine or New Hampshire. It's going to New Haven. But for them, a timber building in the city has a kind of correspondence to a plot of land somewhere in New Hampshire where that wood's coming from. So they're always talking about, like, the sources and the uses and thinking about them together. You can't think about just the city. You have to think about the forestry that's producing that material that's going to go here. Really, really interesting work. In Boston, we've just seen a couple of mass timber buildings going up, a 7-story mass timber building. You can see it, the sort of double beam, Maison Domino. I rode my bike past it and I was like, whoa, someone's doing this already. So there's work being done, which is exciting. In Seattle, Susan Jones has been rewriting the building codes to allow for 8-story, 9-story mass timber buildings, which is really exciting. I visited that with my dad a few months ago. Very exciting to see the exposed timber ceilings, exposed floor, exposed beams. You know, some of these will get covered up, but the hope is that it's also finishes, it's also the feel of the building will be different. One last project I wanted to share, not because it's an answer, but because I think it changes the way we think. And I like that Eric was saying that you need to change culture, not just change technology, not just change material. So culture change is what we're after. How do you change culture? I think you have to rethink your basic understanding of what is nature. So Philadelphia, city on the East Coast, built on trade, right? Built on the river. The Delaware River produced Philadelphia. Philadelphia is actually between the Delaware and the Schuylkill, and both of these rivers connect to coal country. So I think of Philadelphia as like, you know, where American independence sort of had its origins. Think about colonial Philadelphia, but really you should be thinking about coal, right? Energy. Philadelphia is an energy hub. All the coal came down the river, all the refinery that was happening outside of Philadelphia. The river was so polluted it caught on fire, right? That's how polluted the Schuylkill River was. It became the first Superfund site in the United States to remediate, to pull out all that stuff that had been dumped in the river. And so the Schuylkill River is a success story. It's a success story of bringing people back to the riverfront where they can see the river differently. I talk about the urban nature in your backyard, and how do you bring people into a new relationship with urban nature? You have to put them maybe in it, right? They're so used to looking at it or down on it. Could we put them in a relationship with the Schuylkill River that'll change their perception because it'll change their point of view? So we proposed this idea to a mural arts organization, an arts organization that paints murals in Philadelphia. And they asked us to come up with ideas for the river. And we said, how about what we call Float Lab, where you can bring people into a relationship with the Schuylkill River, bring kids into a relationship with the river, into the ecosystems, use it as an outdoor classroom. How do you get a project like this approved? You have to build a mock-up, right? We built a $50,000 mock-up. That's a submarine. So you fill the chamber with water, the barge sinks into the river to just the right level, or you can get someone to stand, oops, he's in the chamber, at the water level. So we built the mock-up. We brought people from the city of Philadelphia. We brought people from the William Penn Foundation. We said, we want Philadelphians to experience the river differently because they don't understand the urban nature in their backyard. How could an art project reshift their thinking about the river, about the species, about the water quality? So this is conceived of as an outdoor classroom. It's a submarine. It's a yellow submarine. And we just got $2 million of funding to build the submarine and build a dock and gangway. So next summer in Philadelphia, we'll be launching Float Lab as a kind of new way to think about our urban nature. So maybe just a couple of thoughts in conclusion. I think we have to hit all these things, right? We have to think about renewables, we have to think about operational, embodied, transport, but fundamentally we have to change the way we look at things, the way we change our perspective about the urban nature that we're sort of participating in, and maybe that's one way forward. Thank you very much.
Fascinating story. Again, demonstrating, right, the integration of academia, sort of creative thinking, and then executing it in the real world. in order to show what can indeed be accomplished. I think the Philadelphia story, I also sort of very much connect to. 10 years ago, the Department of Energy in the United States offered a grant, the largest ever research grant on energy efficiency for retrofit, and $130 million. Never ever happened before, and I don't think it will happen again, but that's another story. And I was part of the team that bidded for it, and we won. Long story short, the site was the Navy Yard in Philadelphia. 130 million or slightly less of R&D investment, 150 million of infrastructure investment. You need to build the stuff. The latest statistics I read, it has generated $750 million of new business in that site, whilst pushing for sustainability, energy efficiency. At that time, when the then Secretary of Energy mooted this idea, everybody thought it was like, what are you talking about? But history again panned out to prove that such vision is indeed a win-win for both the business, economics, and the environment. And this example is another good one. Congratulations, it's great. Okay, with that, I know we're kind of running a little late, but I'm sure all of you are still captivated, right? I hope. Okay, next one is Professor Ho Pui Ping. Again, another partner in crime. Pui Ping came back from Hong Kong, the Chinese University of Hong Kong in 2017, a year after I came back. And he has been a professor and head and also the dean of students at Chinese U for many, many years. He was my boss because I used to go there and teach a class for many years. And then I became his boss when he came back and joined us. So we are all on good equal footing. It's been a great journey working with him as when he came back and served as the head of the Department of Architecture here in the then SDE. And then in the process, he got the UNESCO chair in Architectural Heritage and Conservation and Management. That is a great honor for him to be able to achieve that. And since then, he's able to really leverage on that to push this whole architectural conservation and heritage preservation, both in Singapore and hopefully in the region. So without further ado, let him share what he's been doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Kipo, for the generous introduction. I know time is running short, so my presentation will be quite simple, quite straightforward. We just try to look at sustainability from the conservation point of view. And in Singapore, the conservation practices center on two types of buildings, the shophouses as well as major modernist or even architecture or pre-modern architecture. And so how do we look at the carbon issues in the conservation process? Since I'm holding the UNESCO chair, I have to put this up for the 17 SDGs, and so we all know that. But I was also wondering that the SDG is not just about the environmental sustainability, but it's also about social sustainability and how we can bring the, as Eric said, culture, society, and the environmental issues all together in our sustainable goal, and how the resilience and other aspect of the cities or of city lives or culture can be developed. The UNESCO also did the global report. This was I think 2015, and to look at different study areas. Singapore wasn't selected in this report to see how the various countries or cities followed as well as answered to the idea of the 17 SDGs. But I'm also wondering about the decarbonization issues in heritage conservation and how we can push that both in practice, but also perhaps in research. And so in terms of embodied carbon, Eric talked about that, operational carbon, or maybe totally net zero carbon. And in my sort of research, I came across this document by the British Parliament, working paper, the reports of a small committee to think about net zero carbon in construction. And in that report, the recommendation, we just go direct into that recommendation, the evidence, I quote, we received consistently recommended that retrofit and reuse be prioritized over new build in order to conserve resources, reduce waste, minimize embodied carbon emissions, and provide a cost-effective solution to delivering on housing demands. And the proposed sort of action is to require a circular economy statement for all the buildings. And in some ways, I think they're also trying to reverse our thought process. Instead of tearing down and build new, we have to find a way to prove that building new is sustainable, and building new is the direction, or else you just use the existing building for adaptive reuse. And this, I thought, is a kind of paradigm reversal to think about our own building needs and our own spatial needs. So last year we were involved in the project with DP Architects and Arab on the Kodamau complex. It wasn't required by URA for a conservation consultant to be involved in it, but we came together as a team to think about the conservation approaches as well as code compliance for reusing this particular building. And Arab did a total life cycle carbon calculation based on two models. This one is from RCS and as well as from Leti. And I know our studios, Nirmas and the ISD program also look into some of this calculation. And in this total calculations, we look at the building itself, and we look at the various, I mean, it's a very well-known landmark as a brutalist architecture following many principles, but a lot of as you can see, reinforced concrete in that. So the embodied carbon in this particular building is really massive, and how we can look at the different model, the BCA benchmark, to evaluate, to calculate the model, the carbon, embodied carbon within the building. This is Leti's benchmark, and to look at the whole life cycle calculation with embodied and operational carbon and the kind of saving. Now, this is just a calculation, right? So in the end, I think the Minister, Desmond Lee, talked about the conservation of this project as a conservation also of the embodied carbon. So I was really quite pleased that he picked up the carbon issue even for conservation. Eric talked a lot about this building, and I know Wolfgang is going to talk about the calculation. So some of these slides were from the team and from Bertrand in looking at the carbon that we are able to share. But in this particular case, I thought it would be really interesting to compare the three buildings, SD1 and 3, and SD4, which is a new build building, to look at the life cycle calculation of carbon, two adaptive reuse and one new build, and to see how we look at the whole life cycle, whether we are able to save carbon. The last project really is the art lab, the architecture conservation lab that we opened last November in a building. Sorry for the quality of the aerial shot. We opened the building with Desmond Lee involved. last November, which is a building that was given to us by the Portobello family to be used as a conservation laboratory where we can test materials, students may learn about building techniques, but also engage the public in terms of conservation practices. But one of the things that we are intending to do is to use this particular building for research to think about the carbon issues within the conservation of this shop house and or townhouse with the open internal courtyard, with the external kind of courtyards both in front and at the back of the building. Think about how we can look at the airflow, look at maybe our own renewable energy source, and to think about really net zero carbon even in the operation of this particular building that is conserved. And so this is like in the future that we will be doing research on, and I hope this will also be a kind of research directions for the larger buildings that we have, heritage building. Thank you. I promise I'm short and sweet.
Thank you, Piping, for helping to get back a little bit on time. But I think we shouldn't rush it. That's always my feeling, because I don't know, some of those numbers are really important in comparing the new build versus the renovation. I think more time can be, maybe afterwards in the Q&A we can address some of those moving forward. Okay, for this panel, last but not least, we have Mr. Mok Wei Wei, who is now the Managing Director of W Architects Private Limited. And Wei Wei, of course, is one of our own alumni. It's always good to welcome our alumni who's doing so well and contributing. And he's been very actively supporting the school and the department over the years, as well as in Singapore. So his works have been critically acclaimed, both locally and internationally. He received the President's Design Award in 2007, and that's the highest, at least in Singapore, you can get for all his body of work over time. And of course, he's also been very, very active in community service in all kinds of committees, so much so that the government gave him another medal for all that work. Thank you very much for taking time to join, maybe.
Well, thank you for this opportunity to share. I was actually asked to present a recently completed project, which is adaptive reviews of a national monument. But I'm going to extend that a bit further, because I think adaptive reviews should not be restricted to just buildings with heritage. Equally important are those buildings may not have heritage value, but from the sustainability point of view, they should be adopted as a kind of strategy for planning. So I'm going to show you two other projects which I have been involved in or was involved in with various state statutory boards. And just to show what some of these key decision makers in the planning of Singapore, what kind of attitude and what kind of works they are doing to promote the abatement of embodied carbon. So very quickly, our project first. The lower one. Okay. So it's a power station, and as I say, it is adaptive reuse of a national monument. The power station was built in 1927 and then converted to using steam turbines to gas, and then various usages over the years, warehouse and even entertainment complex, in 2006. In 2009, it was declared a national monument, and we undertook the adaptive reuse conversion in 2021. So in the foreground here, we clean up everything, which was quite messy before, to give it a sort of appropriate setting. And the car parks were all removed to a basement under this green lawn. And In the, I think there's a slide. Okay, sorry, I missed out a point. We then introduce a kind of spine kept very low to make it effective for tropical weather. And this acts as a sort of covered walkway to allow movements into the various entrances. And between these transversing canopies, there are courtyards and landscape, giving a kind of layer of space between the foreground, the spine, and the impressive building facade. So the building it consists of 3 parts, Block A, B, and C, as you know, the previous historic users. And the challenge of this brief is that we have to intensify the gross floor area, GFA, by doubling it. So we don't have the luxury of removal and reduction. The challenge here is how do you add, at the same time, you preserve the kind of integrity of the monument. So floors, like 3 floors, were added over the main block, the central block. This last block, the floor slabs were mainly kept intact. And to enable that to happen, adding while keeping the spatial quality, of course, one of the strategies is to introduce voids strategically. And they are introduced to set away from the historic envelopes. Plus, there is one central void that we introduce for the integration of office spaces as a sort of focal point. I want you to notice some of these structural systems that are inherent in the various blocks of the building and how this thing cuts across them. So this is the view as you enter. A new structure is inserted into this envelope. So the introduction of the voids enable the reading of the original envelope and the construction totally intact. Now this structure, of course, I think in terms of the various strategy that we've been talking about, listening to other presenter, you would have loved to have this building in timber, for instance, But I think we face a lot of constraints. Chief of it is, of course, fire. And of course, we really have a very low sort of ceiling height after inserting this structure to get the necessary GFA. So a concrete building was introduced here. The white ones are the concrete structure that support the new structure. Whereas the floor slab is actually post-tension and allowing holes to be cut in the slab for the existing columns that goes up and support the roof to penetrate the floor slabs. A new leaf is also added. The new floor slabs are conceived as floating decks, and we have introduced this timber-cladded edge here because we like to see this as a sort of structure material, which in contrast to the plaster and masonry of the historic facade. And eventually, this building is occupied by Dyson, the international brand of domestic appliances. And they followed through the idea by putting a timber floor. So the whole thing is read very much intact as a sort of warm material structure. So this is the kind of color scheme that we had put onto the building to differentiate between the steel component and the masonry component. The steel restoration is one of the key aspects of this. The rust were removed, paint were removed, and then the steel were reprimed and then repainted. So after this process, you can see all the original sort of manufacturing stem were made visible again. So this is a central void that I talked about that cuts across Block A, Block B, and an interstitious block. The Block A actually has this structure, steel, but it's sort of enclosed in concrete and in brick and plaster, really. Yeah. And whereas this one is a completely exposed steel structure. So by introducing this void across these 2 buildings, the idiosyncrasy of the original construction is exposed. And then when you look across from this side of the building, you can see the layering of the structure, and which is resulting in quite a rich space. I would say the tenant also adopted this space very well. And if you have a chance to visit the building, they managed to use each slice of the space in a very meaningful and productive way. Also here you can see actually skylights are introduced in the interstitious block as well as the block B. So where possible, the jack roof skylights were introduced. By so doing, actually we are able to keep the lighting power budget, reduce it by 49%. And also the choice of glass, for these skylights are carefully considered so that there is no glare. Now on the topmost floor, we had put the aircon system on the floor level instead of in the ceiling, obviously so that you can see the existing steel trusses intact without the cluttering of the surfaces. The challenge of adopting this large volume building as an office, multi-floor, multi-level, one is of course fire, the other one is acoustic. So in order, the fire department will look at this whole building as one single compartment. So there is no compartmentalization possible. We had to introduce this big exhaust fan at numerous locations so that all the smoke is extracted to the roof through this exhaust fan. Catwalks are introduced to service these fans. And as far as acoustic is considered, which is critical also because the office space are left empty without a lot of office partitions. So sound can travel from lowest level to the top level. So where possible, we introduce acoustic absorptive material. The roof covering was changed. So we take the opportunity to put acoustic panel below it and increasing the depth. So we have to notch it around the existing trusses. So some of the new staircase, which are tucked in certain corners, they are detailed in contemporary ways. And on top of that, we have reused an old catwalk to access to just now those catwalks that you saw. This is an interesting material that happened in Block C. It is a glazed porcelain tile that was commonly used in the 1920s in UK. By the way, the tiles were manufactured in UK. They were used a lot in engineering buildings and hospital. And we found this in the boiler room of the one part of the building. The remaining bit, so we made an effort to extract this together with the wall and leave it as a kind of samples, and part of the history. The window system is a major aspect of the renovation. Originally, they were mouse steel from Crittall, I believe. And in the previous renovation as an entertainment complex, they were changed to aluminum. So in this renovation, we changed it back to mouse steel. But we modified the thickness and the profile of the mouse steel window section so that it can accommodate double glazed unit, DGU. And that's very important because together with the brick facade, they actually created a thermally very efficient building. And together with the chiller system, the whole building is able to bring the median energy usage index 48% lower than the BCA benchmark. The two chimneys, 33 meter high, externally they are restored and replastered. Internally, when we scan the height of this chimney, we discover a layer of soot. The soot were actually there because of the result of the original use. So we made a decision to keep the soot so that they become part of the history. Part of the layering of the history, rather, I should say. Now, the other major exercise here is the restoration of the facade, the brickwork. I think it's the largest brickwork restoration so far in Singapore. The building actually has this self-supporting brick envelope, you know. And the bricks were manufactured in locally, Alexandra Brickwork, I think. You know, it's the first brick factory that manufacture large scales bricks in modern machinery. So, but over the years, the building, of course, deteriorate. And in some of the previous renovation, like in the 2006, the entertainment complex renovation, the restoration was less than desirable. They had used a kind of colored screed, you know, to patch up the damaged parts of the brick. And these colored screeds are, although looks sort of somewhat okay, but actually quite damaging because they stick quite closely to the brick. And then also give it a sort of very artificial look. You know. So we had to painstakingly remove all these because sometimes they bite into the brick structure. Removed it very carefully, and then reveal the original brick. So the principle is that we want to keep the patina of the finishes. We don't want to restore them in a perfect state, you know. So when we reveal the original sort of brick condition, they were left as it is, you know, and then we will restore it by putting a consolidant, and the whole thing is then cleaned with steam rather than water jet. So it's quite a major undertaking, and credit must be given to Studio Lapis, Weng Hin, who is leading the conservation consultancy service, who is a graduate, of course, of NUS. Now, I want to move beyond talking about heritage-related conservation and adaptive reuse, because I think since your topic is about carbon, you know, you should go beyond that. And I want to share two sort of, one is a project, the other one is a planning initiative, which I had the opportunity to be involved in as board members of SLA and JTC. So Singapore Land Authority, I joined them in 2013 and I stepped down in 2019. When I first joined them, I noticed they had something like 3,000 state buildings parked under them, mostly lying idle and not used. So to me, it's such a waste of resources, you know. And I make it my mission, actually, to push for the activation of this building. I'm happy to say that with the support of the very energetic and young CEO, he led the adaptive reuse of an old school, the former Henderson Secondary School, and demonstrate how this can be used effectively as part of SLA's portfolio. So this is the footprint of the school. It consists of 3 parts: and the classroom, the sports hall, and there's an ancillary building. And a tender was called. Well, first they have to talk to the member of parliaments and all that to decide what are the best usage for this place in this constituency. By the way, this is a very mature town. This is Queenstown, you know. So it's one of the oldest public housing estate with mature sort of buildings and also populations. And so the usages arrive at is nursing home and dialysis center for the classroom blocks. And then this little building here will be a childcare center. The center part, they conceive it as some kind of social community usage, like an urban farm. And SLA put in this road, spent about $1 million building the infrastructure. By the way, these projects are not huge profit-making thing. You know, the activation of this building really is to actually demonstrate how building resources can be better employed for community and social benefit. So this is the classroom block, which was still under renovation into a nursing home. This is done by Forum Architect. And then this is the kindergarten part, you know. And the center part, this is the urban farm. Okay. So the nursing home, these are just some figures. Adaptive reuse for nursing home, which, you know, the current, we are building so many nursing homes now in large quantity and great speed. And most of them are, in fact, all of them are purpose-built with a very stringent kind of scheduled accommodation, facilities, that ties in how the place is run. So the adaptive reuse of this building into a nursing home, the feedback after it's done, we talk to the operator, is that, yeah, okay, we may not have some of the specific facilities that's in a standard built for purpose nursing home, but the school and its configuration of the space does yield opportunity for different programming, which I think is also good, because then not all nursing homes are run the same way. The kindergarten, the building is, of course, reused. This is done by another young architect firm that I think must be a graduate from Singapore, FDAT Architects. I can't pronounce that name. It's FDAT. And they put in this very interesting corridor, learning corridor that winds around the landscape. And you can have different stations of learning and games for the kids. So it's very nicely sort of renovated. The center part, the Sprout Hub, the urban farm, is an interesting one because the tender is called in such a way that there's two aspects to consider, not just the price, but also the quality. In other words, they look at the concept that you submit for the using of this way, and then they will give you consideration for the quality. So at the end of the day, this building was given to this particular concept at a very low price, I would say. I won't mention the exact price, but it's below 5 figures. For such a big piece of land, and it was won by two young persons who was just fresh out from national service. So you can see that these two young people came out with this kind of, basically it's a real estate play, because they just carved the open space with plots and lease out $500 a month for people to do their own farming. But to have a plot of land to plant your own vegetables in the middle of town, this is Queenstown, is very precious. So there's a long waiting list, and that's where they can make the money, the business viable. But I think it's also very nice to say that, in the adaptive reuse of this building, sometimes you can afford not to charge the standard rental, and that will promote entrepreneurship. Like these two young boys, I think now they have gone on to do bigger things by bidding for other lands to execute this kind of concept, And in the school hall building itself, there's a vertical strawberry farm that time that was leased by a NUS doctorate thesis student. He's a Chinese national, And he rented this place and did a sort of startup kind of study into strawberry farm. He has still moved out. I don't know whether he has moved out to bigger things or did not work. But at least he could afford to actually rent something like this and experiment a new business. Then I move on to a slightly larger picture. In Singapore, our Green Mark certification, so far all the marks are given to the reduction of operative carbon. Very little in Singapore is talked about regarding embedded carbon. That's why your symposium is so relevant, And we know that to address the issue of embodied carbon, really the whole mindset has to change, as many speakers before have talked about. Your whole sort of vision for the city, instead of profusely building new buildings like what Singapore has been doing all these years, you really have to then have a paradigm shift and looking into how all this building stock that we have invested in can be used in different way, and therefore use different kind of lifestyle patterns and businesses. Jurong Town Corporation, as you know, is one of the 3 major agencies, planning agencies in Singapore. We have the URA that builds a central, take care of the central planning and the land allocation across the island. Then you have the HDB, Public Housing Development Board, that takes care of all the building of the public housing, which house 80% of the population. And you have Jurong Town Corporation that takes care of all the industrial estate and building and land use, etc. So for a major planning agency to now actually they are working on a paper for industrial heritage and adaptive reuse, as a kind of policy, I think is very, very encouraging. So I have the opportunity to work with them on crafting this paper, which is not yet made public, but they allow me to talk a little bit about it now. So beyond the usual conservation and heritage planning strategy, the conservation and the reusing of building really must move beyond heritage value. You should also take into account the low carbon and the sustainability issues. So this is what it says in the sort of URA heritage map. It's all about this very important aspect to consider, but it perhaps need to also input social, economic, and environmental especially, because maybe more buildings should be made to last longer, and there should be a mandate to say you cannot pull down a building below 50 years maybe. And then, so you see, adaptive reuse is going to be a major sort of policy in the JTC framework. So the traditional cycle would be to plan the land, design, and then when the building deteriorates, you just pull it down, demolish for redevelopment. So now this aspect of adaptive reuse is put into consideration. So hopefully it will transit to a lifespan extension, material recovery, urban tracking, so on and so forth. So that in future, even if you build new buildings, is to build them to enable adaptive reuse. In other words, you have to put in a bit of investment. Maybe the column grid had to be larger, structure has to be more robust, so that they can be more flexible, in terms of future use and adaptive reuse of it. So to me, this is quite a paradigm shift taken by a major planning agency. And of course, this you can then justify by comparing different models, and the kind of carbon reduction that you're able to achieve. So in the same principle, renovation will be a major principle, and then new development to design for future. So I think using just now the SDE example, it's very good for NUS to now actually look at adaptive reuse as one of the campus planning strategy. So I think this should be spread to more of the planning agencies. So JTC is one of the first. I'm hoping that we will hear soon from the M&D family, URA and HDB to come up with a similar kind of consideration if we are serious about sustainability in our country. Thank you.
Very much, Wei Wei. It's extremely encouraging. I know we're running time. I apologize, but we're going to invite back the speakers to come up front to have a 10-minute. Please allow me to indulge 10 minutes. I hope you all have questions. And there are microphones around. Please speak into the microphone, introduce yourself, and ask question. The panel speakers will try to answer them. We'll allocate 10 minutes for this part of the session. Okay? Good. All right. Open up to the floor. There we go.
Thanks a lot. And hello, very grateful for this fantastic presentation. I'm a student from DBS, Department of Biological Science in NUS, majoring in biodiversity conservation and nature-based climate solutions. And this presentation gives me a new point of view to how we deal with the climate change and how we should encourage the public to join us to mitigate the climate change. So my question is, how do we just encourage the public, especially from developing countries, for example, China, India, Philippines to use the idealist design, to use the recycle or environmental friendly materials for the buildings, even though they need to pay maybe more than usual? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. All right, anybody? Let me try and pass a mic. Anyone?
I mean, I guess I wasn't trying to propose solutions, although we heard some wonderful examples today. One thing I realized as I was writing the text that's in the book was no one building is going to solve anything. You know, you as an architect, can you design one building, 10 buildings, 50 buildings, maybe, if you're lucky, but you're not going to do it alone, right? And so not only do you need to do good work, and hopefully it also looks good, but also it has to communicate, right? I think, I think of architecture as a broadcast medium, right? Radio, television, film, but architecture broadcasts a set of values. And so I think sometimes buildings have to sort of showcase what they're doing, and I think some of the examples we saw today are wonderful showcases. So it's not just about solving the climate crisis by using less energy or conserving more energy. It's actually convincing others to do the same, right? And so it's not a great answer, but I do think this sort of mindset change and this sort of idea of like showcasing, like if you just do good without anyone seeing it, is that as good as doing good and telling the world what you're doing, right? So I think architecture has an extra challenge to convey and communicate what it's doing and how it's doing it, the didactic aspect of it. So if the project is, the planet, it really requires everything, to change people's minds, to showcase techniques, and really persuade others to adopt similar practices. So the architecture of persuasion, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
Okay, maybe seeing from Singapore's point of view, I think we have the ambition of using our city as a kind of laboratory, So urban solution is a very important aspect of the economic drive, in fact, is one of the 5 pillars, And I think in that, of course, what we are hoping to do is to be able to build a city or enable a city to continue to thrive by creating innovative ideas about how to build, how to plan, but also to set a kind of direction, like what you say, you want to change something, you have first got to change your dream, you see. So if Singapore wants to provide that leadership, I don't think we can just continue building the way we built for the past 50 years. With change and climate change and, the world is never stop, right? So we have to actually plan and demonstrate that we are able to stay ahead and be always relevant. And to me, I think with the carbon issues so pressing, adaptive reuse as a strategy definitely is a paradigm shift, which I don't think we have adequately embraced in Singapore. And maybe that's one of the ways that we can show how a cities can be retained, transformed, and rejuvenate, as one of the important directions. Besides, of course, there will be new building, there will be new parts of the city that has to be replanned. But urban rejuvenation should be one of the key sort of aspect where we can demonstrate leadership. If we were to maybe show to neighboring countries, how a city can be maintained and built.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Eric. And congratulations, of course, on the whole work to hold the team with all the renovations. Fantastic job. So in the light of preservation, in the light of keeping the patina, what we have seen. There was this one remarkable slide you have shown where a student wrote, "I want to be a million miles away." And now it is this courtyard with this top light, Did you consider, or did you even, because I need to look at it, to preserve this as a statement, as something, which is intrinsic, I think, valuable for us as now architects and former students doing this all-nighters and having this. Because I think it's like, you have this, there's a specific relationship with Singapore towards the graffiti, which is a not so good one, right? And so I think there's very much value in this statement that you actually maybe put even a polycarb on top of it and preserve it. I mean, have you considered it in any way?
Yes and no. I mean, of course, it's an amazing. I don't know if it was Wolfgang and I when we were walking through and we took a photo of it. I think maybe Wolfgang will show this statement in better resolution than I do. And that was one of the real drivers. I mean, there were many drivers to the impetus for the renovation, but clearly the poor quality of the studio spaces and the air quality at the time, and it being pretty dangerous. There was no sprinklers in the studios. And so tackling that, I mean, we could go through, there were actually many plans to do an outdoor courtyard to extend out beyond, but these never made it through in the end. So we didn't keep the graffiti. But we did do some things. And I think there is a kind of a tension between revealing the kind of history of the building and also making it, say, dignified enough, let's call it that way. For example, the screeding, which you see inside this lecture room of the beams and there was a debate whether we should have kept it just raw when we pulled out the ceilings. But there was also, would that have been too raw, too rough, because it was never meant to be finished. So there was times where it became painted or we put a screed layer on it. And maybe that could be debated on its embodied carbon, but I think as a finish level, that was discussed. But back to your mezzanine, for instance, the breeze block wall that you see there actually was not there. It was covered over by a gypsum board assembly. And during the course of the renovation, we discovered this, and now we kind of revealed it. We kept some of the tiles, though only one. The building was covered in a mosaic tile, and there's one column that faces out to the campus level on the second level, and there's a portal there. And we kept it there as a kind of vestige of some of the traces of the original architecture.
It's like discovering a Banksy almost, behind a poster.
In some ways, yes.
Work for an asset manager. I think it's quite fabulous that you're actually doing life cycle calculations on carbon. I think that's very critical. And we can understand the retrofit technology very well. My question really has to do with policy making, in the sense that if I put a price on embedded carbon and carbon saved, in terms of your cost calculations, it becomes extremely different, because you're internalizing this externality, for want of a better phrase. To what extent is that discussion actually happening in policy, where I have an embedded price of carbon in my decision making, which therefore will probably result in much better decision making from a carbon perspective?
Wait. I mean, I'm not a policy person, so I'm the wrong person to answer this, but I will just say that I believe that Singapore is looking at increasing the carbon tax, which will progressively add the concern of carbon into the cost of doing a project, right? So as I mentioned in SD4, which is a new build, has, let's say, 5 times the amount of embodied carbon as a retrofit, just to put it there as a number. So whether that 5 times factor of embodied carbon will result in a 5 times cost that's not happening yet. But I think that there's a slow but continuous trajectory that the cost of carbon will become increasingly important in the years ahead.
Yeah, and as I sort of mentioned before, to answer your question, I think there's quite a bit of consideration for operating carbon in our sort of awareness, in terms of certifications and all that, and therefore planning, yeah, because sustainability now is a key sort of focus of the nation, yeah. But amidst all these initiatives and goals, there are many, many gaps. And one of them, of course, is the consideration for embedded carbon, And so I personally don't see a lot of that being reflected in the policy shaping and the planning. Like for instance, our St. James Power Station is a Platinum Award certification. But I can tell you that no marks were given for the fact that it is a retained structure. Nothing is awarded that. So this is a very sort of simple move, that the certifying agency can do to encourage a more holistic approach to planning and in the built environment. So there's certainly many, many areas that we still have to look into. Yeah.
Only following on Wei Wei's point about the 3 planning agencies, when I hear Desmond talk about the preservation of Golden Mile Complex in terms of embodied carbons, I think that's quite encouraging. But whether we can push him to go further to look at that number or that contribution to many other buildings in terms of planning and conservation policy, I think that will be something that we have to push. We have to make that happen. And the carbon tax obviously is another incentive. But when we were talking about SD4 and SD1 and 3 to our own presidents in NUS, I thought he promised that we have 50 net zero carbon and net zero energy building by 2025. So I don't know. I mean, I hope that will happen. Put it out there. So if that's the case, then we'll be one of the, like answering to your questions on campus, we'll preserve at least a quarter of our buildings. And the use of research house will be one example following on SD1 and 3.
It is a paradigm shift, really. And I think NUS should rightfully be a leader in this field, right? Because being a sort of brain center, you should demonstrate.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Yao. This question is personal and should not be construed to be the position or that may be taken by company. Okay, so having said that, what do you assume, if there's a mechanism for something like a carbon mortgage in which, like original sin, when the building is born, you kind of have to pay off its carbon debt over the period of its lifetime. Would that work as a policy instrument or mechanism? I think this question may also go out to more learned members of the audience who are conversant in real estate repayment schemes, whether it can work that way.
No answer.
Wow. Good answer to close. Eric, in your practice and
Just to keep the flow going. I mean, I think it relates to the question that was previous, right? Which is that how do we account for carbon in the action that we do? And which we've heard many times, I think it's 39% of the world's global carbon emissions come from buildings and infrastructure. I mean, I've said this before in lectures that, that's 4 in 10 acres of rainforest destruction are due to buildings and infrastructure. That's 4 in 10 deaths due to climate migration. It's a huge number. So we have a pretty big burden ahead of us, and it needs to be accommodated for in some way. Now, whether it's an original syntax or some other form of other financial instrument that's accounting for it, that will change the value system and change the culture that's for everyone in the room here to work on together. It's not just the architects, it's not just the planners, it's also the financial people, it's BlackRock, it's everybody.
Wolfgang Kessling, if I may offer an answer to this question, I'm not sure if we have a money problem. I think we have a problem to solve a carbon, and not to reduce carbon, to get carbon out of the atmosphere. And I think we need to see that in a bigger context, which with all the money, if we would use it, how could we get it out of the atmosphere? This is something which needs to be folded close to this thing here, which needs to be folded into the discussion. It's not money only. It's like, what are the strategies to reduce carbon locally, in the region, globally, and what is the building sector contributing to this in a short time or in a longer time?
And one last question from Mr.
Maybe not a question. Ken Singh from BCA. I think I'm very encouraged by the questions and the presentations that we got to look at climate change as embodied carbon as well as operational carbon. So on the question why the certification of green mark does not accord as much importance on embodied carbon versus operational carbon, I think we got to maybe look from the perspective of how we prioritize our climate action. In the case of Singapore, we really need to bring down operational carbon a lot. So therefore, the Green Mark II was designed to address that as the #1 priority. But having taken note the interest, the architectural community, some of the developers who also keen to start on the reducing their embodied carbon, we have actually tweaked our Green Mark scheme over the years. There are some credits given for conservation of materials and things like that. And in the latest version of the Green Mark scheme 2021, there is a whole section on whole life carbon. So that will actually, in a way, encourage developers to see how they can, and the project teams, how they can actually bring down the embodied carbon as well as the operational carbon. So I just want to leave this with the audience here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken Singh. Yes. All right. Yeah, I always like Ken Singh has a slide about Green Mark, and it's about the journey. And I always felt that was a very good illustration. And that journey for Singapore is really very short, relatively speaking, right? As opposed to some other economies and some other countries, but it's been remarkable. The kind of regularity and increasing shortening of the time for policy change. That really is something that we should all be mindful of, because the challenges are imminent. Well, I have so much to say, but to thank the entire panel for an incredible presentation, given us a lot of food for thought. I've been asked to make one announcement before we go out for the break. This afternoon, there is an official opening of SDE 1 and 3. There is a ceremony at 4 p.m. downstairs in level 1. Many of you may have already been invited, and that's great, but for the rest of you, you are here as part of this event, the invitation is open to all of you. Just come back this afternoon at 3:30, because we do have a guest of honor. The Deputy Prime Minister, Heng Swee Keat, will be officiating the opening. Okay, so be here by 3:30, although we still have another session after the tea break, which promises to be equally exciting and get into some of the nuts and bolts and some of the technicalities. So I encourage you to stay on to listen to the other half of the story. But all of you are invited, all right, to that opening. And it promises to be a nice overview and videos and talks and so on. By the way, SDE1 has been operational or been occupied for almost 2 years. SD3, where we are, literally just got occupied January. With data and what we already know is happening, we are very, very pleased that BCA has granted us just yesterday, officially, a net zero energy for SD1 retrofit operation. So it's a great achievement for the team, for everybody who has been part and parcel of that journey. So thank you all very much. Tea break is outside. We'll try and take 10 minutes, right? Sorry for the rush, because we want to, excited to hear the rest of the story. So right outside, enjoy your tea break. Thank you.